Even the dance craze of the 1910s and 1920s originated in brothels. Until then, respectable social dancing was limited to upper-class balls where, according to historian Louis A. Ehrenberg, the dancing exhibited control, regularity, and patterned movement. The waltz, the most popular of the respectable dances in the 19th century, required a certain unity in the steps, creating a standardized form of motion. Ehrenberg's description of the waltz, which required a distance between the partners of 3 to 4 inches at the shoulders, increasing downward, shows just how revolutionary were slaves, minstrels, prostitutes, and the renegade Americans who emulated them on the dance floor. The waltz perhaps expressed the emphasis on disembodied love in the 19th century. It was a more companionate dance, to be sure, but the movement of the dance, which, like the mobility enshrined in the society, kept the man and woman apart. Any overtly sexual dancing, especially by women, was considered the practice of only blacks and prostitutes. Moreover, dancing was consigned to private, well-regulated spaces. But by the second decade of the 20th century, renegade pleasures and freedoms bubbled up from the gutter. Jesse Lasky, a vaudeville performer who created Hollywood's first film studio, said that in 1911 it was still scandalous to dance in a public place. But while good Americans were dancing the waltz, bad people were enjoying dirty dancing in houses of ill repute all over the country. Places called concert saloons appeared in cities during the 1840s and 1850s and gained popularity through the 19th century. By 1910, San Francisco's red light district, known as the Barbary Coast, contained more than 300 concert saloons within a 6-block radius, and the south side of Chicago had more than 285. New York's Bowery and Tenderloin, Julia Schmidt's neighborhood, and the French Quarter in New Orleans contained several hundred similar establishments. Concert saloons were known to offer 4 things: liquor, music, dancing, and sex for sale. According to the historian Russell B. Nye, the girls who frequented them were nearly always prostitutes, amateur and professional. They were also, like the brothels of the Wild West, frequently integrated. Many of the concert saloons in the big cities were owned by African Americans, and most were known to host mixed clientele. Even perfectly genteel establishments began to offer the freedoms and pleasures that were previously found only in brothels. In 1912, cafes on Broadway in New York started afternoon dances, often called tango teas, for unescorted women, single men, and even gigolos hired by management to dance with the female patrons. They became all the rage. Moral reformers rightly pointed to the scum of society as the source of the phenomenon. It is simply an evil condition working upward into other strata of society, said Belle Muskowitz, who led a campaign to ban all forms of sensual and public dancing in New York. As the New York World quite accurately noted, from the slum to the state, from the state to the restaurant, from the restaurant to home, the dive dances have clutched and taken hold upon the young who know no better and the old who should. Historians have estimated that in the 1910s, more than 100 new dances became fashionable in perfectly respectable public places. These dances overturned Victorian conventions against overt sexuality. According to Ehrenberg, they fostered an unheard-of casualness between partners, permitted greater options in holds and distances, and symbolized the high value placed on mutual heterosexual intimacy and attraction. Most shocking to the keepers of social order, couples often held each other very close, grasping each other firmly about the waist or about the neck, as in a hug. The one-step, the bunny hug, and the other new dances allowed a lingering close contact. The most influential of the new dances, which scholars cite as the source of both swing dance and the gyrations at early rock and roll dances, were the turkey trot, the foxtrot, the Charleston, and the Texas Tommy. According to the leading historians of American vernacular dance, Marshall and Gene Stearns and Louis Ehrenberg, all of these dances were invented by ex-slaves and their descendants in the South, then popularized among whites by prostitutes in the Barbary Coast district of San Francisco. By turning to the animal world, black culture, and the red light district for the sources of their cultural regeneration, writes Ehrenberg, well-to-do urbanites were searching for a way to liberate some of the repressed, wilder elements, the more natural elements, that had been contained by gentility. Pistols and paint. American prostitutes gave the lie not only to the Victorian belief that women were innately asexual, but also to the common assumption that women were incapable of defending themselves from physical violence. Biographies of virtually all the major madams include at least one story of armed self-defense against a male assailant. Jessie Hayman always kept a pistol in her pocket. "I keep my customers close, and my gun closer," she often said. "It's helped me settle many an argument." Caroline Cad Thompson, the queen of the silver mining town Virginia City, Nevada, responded to her husband's threat to kill her by pointing a pistol at his head and holding him at bay until the police arrived. When Big Nose Kate Horany was 15 years old, she stopped a man from raping her by knocking him unconscious with an axe handle. Later, as a prostitute in St. Louis, Horany gained fame by shooting to death a man who had killed the madam who was her mentor. Eleonora Dumont was known to have shot many men in her days roaming the West, and on one occasion she saved not only herself, but an entire town on the Missouri River in Montana. When a steamboat known to be carrying smallpox attempted to unload its passengers, Dumont aimed her Derringer pistol at the captain and fired 2 shots into the deck just inches from his feet. "The second shot was to prove the first was no accident," she said. "If you don't turn this boat around, the next bullet goes through your head." With that, the captain turned his wheel and sped off down the river. It is common now for feminists and others critical of our beauty culture to think of women's use of fashion and cosmetics as submission to male desire, the promotion of superficiality over substance, a means to conformity, narcissistic, and a form of self-oppression. These criticisms are not new, nor were they launched by women. Moralistic Englishmen first raised the cry against cosmetics in the 17th century. Puritan clergyman Thomas Tuke's 1616, A Discourse Against Painting and Tincturing, warned that cosmetics were brought into use by the devil to make women worship themselves. By allowing women to remake themselves, cosmetics violated the natural order. And though she be the creature of God, as she is a woman, yet is she her own creaturess, as a picture. Tuke counseled women who wished to be respectable to leave these base arts to the common strumpets, of whom they are fittest to be used, that by that filthiness they may be known and noted. In early modern England, as later in the young United States, makeup was the tool of whores. To most Americans, writes historian Kathy Pice, the painted woman was simply a prostitute who brazenly advertised her immoral profession through rouge and coal. In the 19th century, newspapers, tracts, and songs associated paint and prostitution so closely as to be a generic figure of speech. Makeup represented the aesthetic side of vice. Prostitutes were the first women in America to wear brightly colored clothes, and red was the color of the sex trade. The protagonist in Nathaniel Hawthorne's My Kinsman, Major Molyneux, recognizes the lady on the street with a saucy eye as a prostitute by her scarlet petticoat. George G. Foster's 1850 account of street life in New York by gaslight tells of two ladies who were immediately identifiable as prostitutes by their extravagant jewelry, dresses of an ultra-fashionable make, and shawls of that gorgeous scarlet whose beamy hue intoxicates the eye. In Nella Larson's 1928 novel, Quicksand, a woman wearing a red dress at a church revival meeting is singled out as a fallen woman. At the sight of the bare arms and neck growing out of the clinging red dress, a shudder shook the swaying man at her right. On the face of the dancing woman before her, a disapproving frown gathered. She shrieked, "A scarlet omen! Come to Jesus, you poor, lost Jezebel!" By the early 20th century, as more and more women left the countryside and entered the expanding world of the city and all its freedoms, Pice notes, they made elements of this racy public style their own. Pice found that between 1909 and 1929, the number of American perfume and cosmetics manufacturers nearly doubled, and the factory value of their products rose tenfold, from $14.2 million to nearly $141 million. And sociologist Robert Lind estimated that by the end of the 1920s, Americans were spending $700 million per year for cosmetics and beauty services. The first respectable woman to adopt the styles of prostitutes were women at the high and low ends of the economic scale, saleswomen in department stores, factory workers, and upper-class socialites. At the new urban dance halls where working girls predominated, the liberal use of rouge, powder, and lipstick was an almost universal custom. Many newspapers noted that the wealthiest women had adopted the look of the street. In 1890, the New York World reported that society women now paint, even those in very select circles. Having moved past the taboo of making up, it is the very best upper crustum that puts aside tradition and authority and bedizens itself as much as it pleases. By the 1910s, according to Pice, it was often difficult to distinguish the dress and style of respectable women from prostitutes at dances. In 1917, vice investigators at a New York dance hall were told by a waiter, "The way women dress today, they all look like prostitutes." The movement, begun by prostitutes, did not go unchallenged. A woman complained to the Baltimore Sun in 1912 that in the past, the painted face was the bold, brazen sign of the woman's character and calling. But now, women and young girls of a respectable society are seen on our streets and fashionable promenade with painted faces. The social reformer and feminist Lillian D. Wald complained in her 1915 memoir of working-class girls on the Lower East Side adopting the customs of prostitutes, including a pronounced lack of modesty in dress, which, along with their dancing, their talk, their freedom of manner, all combined to render them conspicuous. In 1920, a juvenile court judge in Los Angeles restricted a delinquent teenage girl from any use of makeup, such as rouge and pencil, which she has been using against her mother's desire for some time in the past. And more than half of the girls in a 1937 study reported fighting with their parents over lipstick. The use of makeup was, according to Pice, seen by many young women as a means to freedom, pleasure, and control of their own lives. The sudden appearance of rouge and lipstick on a teenage girl's face often accompanied a demand to keep more of her wages, to choose her boyfriends, and to enjoy greater autonomy in leisure activities. Despite the efforts of sexual conservatives, by the middle of the 20th century, the looks pioneered by prostitutes were not only respectable, but also normal. Massive adoption of whore style began in the 1910s when, for the first time, respectable women unabashedly revealed the skin below their necks. An unprecedented public display of the female figure characterized the period, writes the historian James R. McGovern. Hems became shorter. Hosiery was rolled down to reveal parts of the leg, and dresses were deeply cut to expose cleavage. In 1917, Ladies' Home Journal offered fashion advice that just a few years earlier could have been the words only of a madam. Fashion says evening gowns must be sleeveless. Afternoon gowns are made with semi-transparent yokes and sleeves. Women smoking and drinking in public, which had been the exclusive practice of prostitutes and unassimilated German immigrants, were becoming fashionable for married women of the upper class and were making headway at other class levels. The famous, short, cropped, often wavy hairstyle of the flappers of the 1920s was seen by many as a rebellion against the maternal femininity of the Victorian era, when women were expected to wear long hair elaborately arranged on top of the head. To many flappers, the weight and the work of the Victorian style literally and symbolically kept women from moving freely. But historians of prostitution have found evidence that short hairstyles were first adopted in brothels. Photos taken of New Orleans prostitutes in 1912 by E.J. Belloc show many wearing what would become the dominant hairstyle of the 1920s and 1930s. Similarly, a 1913 Vice report in Philadelphia noted that a black prostitute wore black bobbed hair. 20 years later, the style, pioneered by prostitutes, was so popular that the First Ladies Lou Henry Hoover and Eleanor Roosevelt wore it in their official portraits. In 1933, Vogue magazine declared wearing lipstick one of the gestures of the 20th century. Pice found evidence of many mothers of the 1930s adopting their daughters' beauty regimens, and a few mothers who seem to have gone beyond their daughters in embracing the modern style of flaming youth, despite traditional proscriptions. The sociologist Walter Reckless said it best in his 1933 study of prostitution in Chicago. Until the 1910s, prostitutes were in fact an outcast group with distinctive manner, dress, style. They lived in the half-world, where they were free to do what was taboo for the respectable woman. The painted lady of the street had an uncontested monopoly of rouge, the bleaching of hair, and strong perfumes, all of which have been means of sexual attraction. But by the 1920s, women of ill fame no longer formed a distinct caste readily distinguished from other women by dress, manners, and place of residence. The activities of modern women, slumming, nightlife, exaggerations in dress, an unchaperoned life outside the home, entrance into business and sports, have erased the outward distinction between the painted sport and the paler protected lady. Even the scarlet shame of whores became the symbol of American female respectability. At the unveiling of the First Lady's Red Dress Collection, a charity for heart disease begun in 2005, Laura Bush spoke on behalf of her 6 predecessors. Mrs. Reagan's love of the color of red is well known. Maybe her passion started when a dashing Ronald Reagan proposed to her in a red-upholstered booth at a bistro in Los Angeles. America's first ladies have found many occasions to wear red. Lady Bird Johnson celebrated her 80th birthday in her red evening gown. Betty Ford's and Rosalind Carter's red dresses were reliable favorites. Barbara Bush wore red to a state dinner, accompanied, of course, by her pearls. Hillary Clinton's red dress set just the right tone on Valentine's Day. And I wore my red dress to the Bolshoi Ballet in Moscow. We've all made good use of our red dresses, and now we're using them to promote our common interest in women's health. Black and tan. During the height of Jim Crow, The period in the late 19th and early 20th centuries when lynchings were weekly events in the South and not uncommon in the North. Countless thousands of black men had sex with white women, with impunity, in the brothels of the wild towns of the West. In fact, no place on the planet was more integrated than the 19th century Western whorehouse, saloon, or dance hall. This is all the more remarkable considering that the heyday of the Wild West coincided with the advent of segregation in the rest of the country. In nearly every Western boomtown, one could find blacks and whites living next to Asians and Native Americans, and immigrants of dozens of nationalities working alongside native-born Americans. Many residents and travelers in the West reported on the kaleidoscopic social makeup of saloons and dance halls. They also reported on the high incidence of interracial sex, in particular, but not exclusively, in brothels. Black and tans, brothels employing white and black prostitutes, were common. Even the brothels that were segregated stood side by side in the red light districts. In big Western cities like Denver, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, the typical brothel contained not just black and white prostitutes, but also women from China, Japan, Mexico, and all parts of Europe. There were Jewish madams, and Italian madams, and Cherokee madams. Chinese and Mexican madams controlled much of the commerce in early San Francisco and Los Angeles. There were many wealthy, powerful, and famous madams who had been born into slavery. Bad women pioneered social integration. Molly Johnson, the Queen of the Blondes in roughneck Deadwood, South Dakota, broke through just about every barrier for white women in Victorian America. She celebrated the success of her brothel by parading through the streets in carriages dressed in the highest fashions of the time. She and her ladies frequently appeared in press reports of their wild and public debaucheries. And in 1878, she married the local stage performer Lou Spencer, also known as Dutch Nigger Lou Spencer. Johnson continued her profession through her marriage and, as one historian puts it, didn't act much like any other married woman. Archivists at the Montana Historical Society found from studying 19th century censuses that black Montanans were not segregated into separate neighborhoods as they were in most of the country. Rather, they lived side by side, sometimes even in the same domicile, as peers with white Montanans. The red light districts in early Los Angeles were notorious not just for their dens of vice, but also for their multi-hued populations. City ordinances created in 1876 confined prostitution to poor and mixed-ethnic neighborhoods. For many decades, Los Angeles police rarely interfered in the red light districts, contributing to their renegade character. This, according to historian Mark Wilde, encouraged participants in the sex trade, both workers and customers, to converge on those neighborhoods regardless of their ethno-racial background. Whites in Los Angeles, who might have segregated themselves in other social contexts, therefore came much closer to other Angelenos when they bought or sold sexual favors. The integration of desire was not just black and white. When Protestant ministers launched a campaign to eliminate the city's red light districts in 1903, they distributed flyers offering to rescue prostitutes in English, Chinese, Spanish, Portuguese, German, and French. In 1917, the California Commission of Immigration and Housing named the major red light district the most cosmopolitan district of Los Angeles. 1 year later, the Church of All Nations, a Methodist missionary organization in the district, counted 42 nationalities in its vicinity. This is not to suggest that prostitutes were morally committed to racial justice, but that, like all good renegades, they were committed to no morality. When asked by a university researcher in the early 1930s why they serviced customers of other races, a white prostitute and a black prostitute gave similarly self-interested answers. "It ain't that I'm so crazy about colored men," the white woman explained. but I can make more money here among them. The black woman was motivated, as well, by only one thing. I like to have white trade because they will pay more. The great migration of African Americans from the rural South to cities, which began in great numbers during World War I, when large numbers of industrial jobs opened up as white men left for military service and peaked in the 1920s, also produced an exodus across the sexual color line. In Chicago and New York, moral reformers reported on the proliferation of brothels that sold the violation of America's greatest taboo. Some brothels in the cities during this period were for whites, some for blacks, according to the historian Kevin J. Mumford. But the majority were probably black-white clubs, the institutional descendants of black and tans. Many of these establishments catered to a particular black-white dyad, whether black men seeking white prostitutes or white men seeking black. In 1928, 1 year before Martin Luther King Jr. was born and decades before the civil rights movement began, undercover investigators of speakeasy houses of prostitution found racial integration nearly everywhere they looked. One particularly thriving New York establishment called Span's advertised itself as a club of white inmates for colored men. Another speakeasy was described by investigators as employing white inmates operated for colored men only. When a Chicago reformer visited a black-white club, he found 9 white women, 8 of whom were there in the company of black men. The moral reformers surveilling this underground scene were particularly appalled when they saw white women enticing black men with dancing that was very sexual and indecent, degenerate, and obscene. A Chicago Vice investigator reported on a club in which black men were seen dancing with white girls, and vice versa. The actions of these people, of course, were absolutely disgusting. Worst of all were the white prostitutes who didn't mind servicing black customers, such as the women in a New York speakeasy who worked part-time as a hostess in a Broadway nightclub, but also consorted with black men in Harlem and declared that she preferred the colored man's technique. Like their counterparts in the western boomtowns, the proprietors of black-white brothels in the northern cities were pure renegades who cared little for morality, social conventions, or the wishes of the community. As one put it, "We take anybody that has the money." And like all renegades, they opened freedoms for countless people. As Mumford puts it, despite the power of the taboo and the strictness of its enforcement, the fact remained that for black men migrating to the north, the availability of white prostitutes in predominantly black urban areas must have represented a significant change from life under Jim Crow. What was held up in the South as both most desirable and most taboo, white womanhood, was in the North readily available to the African American man able to spend $5 or $6. Prostitutes set loose pleasures and freedoms that became part of legitimate American culture, but they were punished nonetheless. Social purity. Beginning in the 1870s, prostitution was hit by waves of attacks. Some medical authorities and police officials wanted to force prostitutes to register with the state and be placed under close surveillance by doctors and police. The regulationists argued that prostitution could never be eliminated due to the debauchery of the degenerate, already past hope of redemption. Far more successful was the movement to abolish prostitution entirely. Organizations formed all over the country devoted to the eradication of not just the oldest evil, but also to newer ones, such as pornography, which they defined broadly. What came to be called the social purity movement was the spiritual descendant of the Founding Fathers. Virtuous republicanism, the abolitionists' attack on the debauchery of slavery, and the Freedmen's Bureau mission to civilize the ex-slaves. The movement was led largely by women who helped create modern feminism. Organizations such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the National Purity Association became training grounds for the suffrage movement and were enormously powerful lobbying groups between the 1870s and World War I. There were some men involved, and not every social purity activist supported women's suffrage or property rights, but, as Ruth Rosen puts it, feminism and social purity were very much intertwined, with members of each movement supporting causes of the other. In the 1910s, semi-legal vice commissions were formed in virtually every major city with the goal of absolute annihilation of the social evil. They carried ominous names like the New England Watch and Ward Society, the New York Committee of 14, and the Los Angeles Morals Efficiency Committee. Headed by august gentlemen but staffed mostly by female social workers, the vice commissions conducted investigations using undercover agents, publicized their findings in local newspapers, and lobbied aggressively for municipal and state authorities to take action against brothels, madams, prostitutes, and their clients. Between 1910 and 1915, some 35 vice commissions issued reports declaring that prostitution was an intolerable fact of life. Special courts were established to handle the new wave of prosecutions, including the Domestic Relations Court in Philadelphia, the Morals Court in Chicago, and the Women's Court in New York. Several states built reformatories for prostitutes to be made into respectable women. Inmates were made to practice sewing, cleaning, and cooking. More often, judges sent convicted prostitutes to county workhouses. The federal government did its part in 1910 with the passage of the Mann Act, also called the White Slave Traffic Act, which made illegal the transportation of women across state lines for immoral purposes. Between 1909 and 1917, 31 states passed red light abatement laws, allowing courts to shut down buildings for immoral purposes. Further, in the 1910s, most states specifically made illegal the keeping of a disorderly house or in any way managing prostitutes as a madam or a pimp. No city completely eliminated prostitution. In most cases, however, reports Ruth Rosen, the chief of police responded to civic pressure simply by ordering the closing of the red light district. In cities from coast to coast, prostitutes were forced onto the streets. Arrests for street walking skyrocketed across the nation, and most of the arrested women were sent to reformatories and workhouses. Without the protection of a madam and the four walls of a brothel, facing hostile police and some sadistic customers, prostitutes had nowhere to turn but to male criminals. Given these conditions, writes Rosen, it is not surprising that pimps began dominating the practice of prostitution. With its banishment, prostitution was moved from female power to male power. Though they were certainly exploited in brothels, madams and prostitutes had wielded considerable power in their relations with customers. Now, prostitutes became the easy targets of both pimps and organized crime. In both cases, the physical violence faced by prostitutes rapidly increased. Responding to the argument made by moral reformers that sinful behavior was genetically determined, by 1913, 12 states had passed laws that allowed judges to order the sterilization of criminals, perverts, idiots, and the feeble-minded. Prostitutes were generally thought to belong to all four categories. As one investigator in Massachusetts put it, the general moral insensibility, the boldness, egotism, and vanity, the love of notoriety, the lack of shame or remorse, the absence of even a pretense of affection or sympathy for their children or for their parents, the desire for immediate pleasure without regard for consequences, the lack of forethought or anxiety about the future, all cardinal symptoms of feeble-mindedness, were strikingly evident in every one. Maud Minor, a leading feminist and suffragist, and director of the Waverly House for Women, a reformatory in New York City, claimed that 1/4 of prostitutes under her tutelage acquired their attitudes and behaviors from some actively, viciously element, or clearly degenerate strain, drunkenness, or prostitution. Typical was Elsie, one of Miner's wards, whose feeble-mindedness was inherited from a degenerate family of worthless alcoholics. And so, between 1907 and 1950, some 40,000 women were forcibly sterilized, most for being prostitutes, or sexually immoral. Prostitutes joined the urban rabble and bad niggers as martyrs for our freedom.